You want to know about the silent girl. Everyone does, eventually. They come up the path to my door with their aching knees and their bad coughs, and somewhere between the willow bark and the goodbye they lean in and ask the same thing. Maeve, is it true? About the girl who didn't speak. It's true, I was there. I'm old enough now that most of the people who could argue with me are buried under the pines, so I'll tell it the way it happened, not the way the songs tell it. She came to our valley in the back of a trader's cart on the worst day of winter I can remember. I was the one who lifted the blanket off her. She was maybe 9 years old, blue around the mouth, and she had her arms wrapped around a younger child who had already stopped breathing. A little brother, we found out later. There'd been a raid on a southern hold, fire, the usual ugly business, and somehow these two had crawled out of it, and somehow only one of them had survived the road north. I peeled her fingers off the dead boy one at a time. She let me. She didn't cry. She didn't make a single sound. And I remember thinking, that poor thing has cried herself empty. She'll start up again once she's warm. She never did. Not that winter, not the spring after, not in all the years she lived among us. People decided she was simple. That's the kind word for it. The unkind words I won't repeat. Our valley folk are not cruel, exactly, but they are quick. And a child who stares at you with steady gray eyes and never answers, well, people build a story around a silence faster than they'll build one around a scream. By the time she was grown, they'd long since settled on it. Lyra the mute. Lyra who doesn't understand. Touched in the head, pretty enough, pity she's broken. I knew different. I knew it the first month she lived in my cottage, before the family 2 ridges over took her in to mind their goats. I'd be grinding something at the table and I'd say, half to myself, asterisk now, where did I put the marjoram? And her eyes would go straight to the high shelf where it sat. I'd say nothing about a kettle, and the kettle would be off the fire before it screamed. She understood every word that fell out of every mouth in that valley. She just chose, very deliberately, to give nothing back. I never asked her why. I think I was the only one who didn't, and I think that's why she trusted me. Now, you have to understand what kind of place this was to understand what happened. We were a mountain pack, the hollow pine, scattered across a long valley under the gray peaks, and like all the packs in those days, we lived by the old law. Most of the old law was sensible, but there was one part of it that I have hated my whole life, and that was the gathering. Every 4th autumn, when the larches turned and the first ice scummed the edges of the river, the unclaimed of the pack were brought to the great hall. The men of standing came too, the lords of the smaller holds, the ones with land and wolves under them, and they walked the rows like buyers at a horse fair. A man could lay claim. If 2 laid claim to the same one, they settled it between themselves, and you can guess how. The one who was claimed had a right to refuse in theory. In practice, refusing a powerful man was a fine way to find your family's water rights gone the next spring, or your roof unmended, or worse. So most didn't refuse. Most learned to smile and call it tradition. I delivered half the children in that valley. I have set more broken bones and closed more eyes than I can count. And the thing that has eaten at me longest is not the wars or the winters. It's the gathering and the faces of the girls in the firelight, doing math behind their eyes that no child should have to do. The autumn Lyra turned 19 was a gathering year. She knew what was coming. Of course she did. She'd watched 4 of them by then. She'd seen the older girls she grew up beside walk into that hall and come out belonging to someone, and she had a particular reason to be afraid because of Vaughn. Vaughn held the eastern ridges. He was a big man, broad through the chest, with a way of standing too close and a smile that never once reached his eyes. He'd buried 2 mates already. People didn't say much about how. There are some questions a poor pack does not ask a rich lord, and the absence of the questions tells you everything. He was the sort who took what pleased him and let the law dress it up afterward. And he'd noticed Lyra. I'd seen it the summer before. She was hauling water from the river, and he rode past with 2 of his men, and he reined in and watched her the whole length of the path. Watched her the way you watch a thing you've already decided to own. And here is the part that turned my stomach. I could see exactly what he was thinking. That one won't argue. That one can't even tell anyone. A silent girl is a safe girl to a man like Vaughn. No accusations. No tears the neighbors might hear. No words at the gathering when the elder asks, as he must, do you consent? A nod or a shake of the head, that's all she could give, and a nod is easy to read into a frightened child standing in front of 100 people, and the man who already owns half the valley's grain. He went to the elders that summer and made it known. He intended to claim the mute girl at the autumn gathering. He even paid a sort of courtesy price to the goat family who'd raised her, which was his way of telling everyone it was settled before it had even begun. When I heard, I walked the 2 ridges to where she lived, and I found her in the goat shed, mending a fence in the failing light. I didn't soften it. She wouldn't have thanked me for softening it. Vaughn means to claim you in autumn, I said. He's told the elders. She didn't stop working. Her hands kept moving on the willow withes, weaving them tight. But I'd known her since she was blue around the mouth in a trader's cart, and I saw the thing that went through her. A stillness inside the stillness. Her jaw set. And then she looked at me, and for once I could not read her at all, and that frightened me more than tears would have. She wove that fence so tight a wolf couldn't have got through it. Then she stood, and she looked east, toward the ridges, for a long time. I should tell you about the king now, because the king is the reason this isn't just another sad story I'd rather not tell. We had a young king in those years, Sauron. He'd taken the high seat maybe 3 winters before, after his father died, and he was not what anyone expected. The old king had been a roaring sort, all teeth and feasts and grievances. Sauron was quiet. He'd spent his youth on the borders, fighting actual wars, the kind that leave a man with not much patience for ceremony. He didn't visit the holds much. He had a reputation for showing up where he wasn't expected and seeing things he wasn't meant to. There was a story that went around. I can't swear it's true, but it's the kind of true that tells you who a man is. They said that early in his reign he'd ridden into a hold where a lord was overworking his people half to death, and the lord had put on a great feast to flatter him, and Sauron had sat through the whole thing, said almost nothing, eaten almost nothing. And at the end, instead of thanking the lord, he'd asked to see the man's grain stores, and then the workers' grain stores, and he'd looked at the difference between the two, and he'd given the hold to the lord's steward and sent the lord to the borders to learn what a hard winter felt like. That was Sauron, a watcher, a man who counted the things other men hoped he wouldn't count. Nobody expected him at our gathering. Kings didn't bother with the small mountain packs claiming knights. So when the word came down the valley 3 days before the king rides to Hollowpine, make ready the hall, there was a kind of joyful panic. Floors scrubbed, the best stags hunted, the elders in a flap about precedence. Everyone assumed he was passing through on his way to somewhere that mattered and had decided to honor us with a night. Only later did I wonder how a king who showed up where he wasn't expected might have heard, on the wind, that a certain eastern lord with 2 dead mates behind him meant to claim a girl who couldn't speak a word against him. But I'm getting ahead. Let me set the night for you, because I remember it the way you remember the nights that split your life into before and after. It was cold. The first true cold of the season, the kind that makes the stars look like chips of ice and your breath hang in front of your face. The great hall was packed and roaring with 2 long fires down the center, the smoke curling up into the black rafters, the smell of roast meat and pine resin and too many bodies. They'd hung the old banners. The unclaimed sat along one wall on a low bench, a dozen of them, scrubbed and dressed in whatever finery their families could manage, and you could feel the fear coming off the far end of that bench like heat off a stone. Lyra sat at the very end. They'd put her in a gray dress the goat family's daughter had outgrown. Someone had braided her dark hair and pinned it with a little sprig of dried heather, which was a kindness, and which made the whole thing worse somehow. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her spine straight, her face perfectly calm. Anyone glancing at her would have seen a simple, placid girl who didn't understand the danger she was in. I was standing near the side door with the other old folk who get to come and watch but not to sit, and I was watching her hands. They were folded too still. The knuckles were white. She knew exactly what she was sitting in the middle of, and she had poured every scrap of her terror down into those two folded hands and left her face empty so that none of it would show. Vaughn came in late, the way powerful men do, so that the room would have to notice him. He had his eastern wolves with him, 6 or 7, all in good leather, and he took a place near the high fire and let everyone see him look down the bench at Lyra and smile. Then the horn blew, and the hall went quiet and the king came in. I'd never seen him before. I don't know what I expected. Gold, maybe. A crown. He wore plain dark wool and a wolf-gray cloak, and he walked in like a man walking into his own kitchen. He was younger than I'd thought, and there was a scar that pulled at one eyebrow, and his eyes went around that hall once slowly, taking the count of it before he'd taken 3 steps inside. I watched those eyes pass over the unclaimed on the bench. And I watched them stop on Lyra. It was only a heartbeat. He kept walking, took the high seat, accepted the cup the elders pressed on him. But I'd seen it. Of all the scrubbed and frightened faces on that bench, his eyes had caught on the one at the very end, the one everyone else had decided not to look at too hard. And I thought, though I told myself I was a foolish old woman imagining things, he saw something. He saw something none of the rest of them had bothered to see in 10 years. What he saw, I'd learned before the night was out, and it would turn that hall over like a plow turns a field. But that's the next part of the telling, and my throat's gone dry. Pour me something and I'll go on. So, where was I, the king in his plain wool on the high seat, and the fires roaring, and a dozen frightened souls on the bench waiting for the old law to come and find them? The gathering has a shape to it, an order like everything the old folk built. First the feasting, an hour or 2 of it, so everyone's belly is full and the wine has gone round and the cruelty to come will feel like part of a celebration. Then the elder rises and speaks the law, the same words every 4th autumn, about the strength of the pack and the joining of holds and so on, words worn smooth as river stones from saying. And then the claiming begins. I barely touched the food. I kept my place by the door and I kept my eyes moving between 3 points. Lyra at the end of the bench, still as a held breath. Vaughn near the fire, getting redder and louder with each cup, leaning to murmur things to his men that made them laugh. And the king. The king ate almost nothing. I noticed that, and it brought the old story back to me, the lord and the grain stores. He sat with his cup untouched in front of him, and he watched the hall the way I imagine a wolf watches a clearing, not anxious, just complete. Nothing moved in that room that he didn't see, and more than once his gaze went back to the end of the bench, and then to Vaughn, and then back, like a man laying 2 things side by side to compare them. When the feasting was done, the elder rose. Old Beorn it was, who's been dead these many years now. He spoke the law. The hall quieted, and then he said the words that opened the claiming. If any man of standing would lay claim, let him stand and speak it now. The pause after that is the worst silence in the world. Every family with a child on that bench holds its breath, hopping and dreading both, and the children themselves sit there learning what it is to be a thing that other people decide about. Vaughn stood up. He didn't hurry. He let the bench creak under him and he let everyone watch him rise, and then he stepped out into the open space between the fires where the firelight could find him. He bowed to the king. A shallow bow, the kind that's really about showing you don't have to bow deep. My king, he said, an honor to have you witness this. It makes the night worth more. A little laugh ran round his men. I'll keep it short. I lay my claim on the girl Lyra of no hold raised here in the valley. I've spoken to the elders. The matter's near settled. I only ask the king's blessing on it. That's all a formality. He turned to look down the bench at her as he said it, a look of ownership, a look that said, don't bother asterisk. And here is where you'd expect the elder to ask the question. Do you consent? It's in the law. The claimed has the right of refusal. Beorn started to turn toward her, started to draw the breath to ask it. And Vaughn talked over him, smooth as anything. No need to trouble the poor thing, Elder. We all know she can't answer, can't speak a word, never has. It'd only frighten her. He spread his hands, reasonable, kind, a man sparing a simpleton the strain. I'll be gentle with her. She'll want for nothing. A roof over a girl like that is more than she'd ever find for herself. And do you know, the hall murmured agreement. People nodded, because it sounded like mercy. That was Vaughn's gift, the thing that made him dangerous. He could dress the taking of a thing up as a favor to the thing he was taking, and make a whole room of decent people nod along. I felt sick. I looked at Lyra, and her hands were no longer folded. They were gripping the edge of the bench so hard I could see the cords in her wrists, and her chest was moving fast and shallow, and her eyes were on the door, measuring it. The way I'd seen her measure exits her whole life. She was a child in a trader's cardigan, doing the math, how far, how fast, who's between me and out. Beorn hesitated. He was an old man, and Vaughn held the Eastern water rights, and the truth is the old elder didn't have the spine for it. He started to say something that was going to be a yes. That's when the king spoke. He didn't stand. He didn't raise his voice. He just said into the murmur quietly, so that the whole room had to go still to catch it. Ask her. Everything stopped. Vaughn turned, the smile still on but stiffer now. My king, as I said, the girl can't. I heard what you said. The king's voice was even. He still hadn't moved. You said she can't answer. I'm telling the elder to ask her anyway. The law says the claimed has the right of refusal. The law doesn't say only the ones who can shout get it. A pause. Ask her, Beorn. You could have heard the fires breathing. Beorn, caught between a king and a lord, did the only safe thing and obeyed the king. He turned to Lyra, and his old voice shook a little, and he asked the question that hadn't been truly asked of her in her whole silent life. Child, do you consent to this claim? And the whole hall waited for her to do what everyone knew she'd do, sit frozen, or give a small lost nod, the nod of a frightened girl who doesn't understand, which Vaughn would scoop up as a yes before the elder could blink. Lyra stood up. She stood up off that bench so fast it scraped, and she shook her head. Once. Hard. No. And then when the room just stared, because a headshake from the mute girl could still be argued, could still be called confusion, fear, a fit, she did the thing none of us had ever seen. She raised her hands, and she began to sign. Now I have to stop and tell you something, because this is the heart of it and you'll miss it otherwise. There is a sign speech. The deaf use it in the river towns, and the old hunters use a rougher kind for talking across a valley without spooking the game. I knew a little of it myself from a deaf girl I'd treated years before, but almost no one in our high valley knew it. It was a foreign thing, a thing from elsewhere. And Lyra knew it, all of it, fluently. Her hands moved fast and certain and furious, shape after shape after shape, and it was the most words any of us had ever seen come out of her, but only 3 or 4 people in that whole hall could read a single one of them. To everyone else it was just the mute girl waving her arms, having her fit, exactly as Vaughn had promised. He pounced on it. You see, he said, almost gentle, turning to the king, opening his hands to the room. The poor creature's distressed. She doesn't understand what's being asked. This is precisely why I said spare her the. She understands perfectly, the king said. And he stood up. He came down off the high seat and he walked out into the open space, and he looked at Lyra, and he did the thing that broke the night open. He raised his own hands, and he signed back to her. I'll never forget the sound the room made. It wasn't a word. It was a sort of indrawn breath, 100 people understanding at once that the ground had moved. The king knew the sign speech. Of course he did. He'd spent his youth on the borders in the river towns, fighting beside men of all kinds, deaf scouts among them, who could pass silent signals across a battlefield. He'd learned it the way a soldier learns anything useful. and he was the one man in that hall with the rank to walk into the middle of it and answer the silent girl in her own tongue, in front of everyone, so there could be no more pretending she hadn't spoken. What did he sign? I only caught pieces, my hands were over my mouth. But the deaf girl's mother was standing near me, and she read it out under her breath, and I've held onto every word. He signed, "You spoke. I heard you. Say it again so they all know I'm not lying for you." And Lyra, oh, Lyra. The calm she'd worn all her life cracked right down the middle, and what was underneath was not simple and not broken. It was a grown woman who had been screaming silently for 10 years and had finally been handed the air to do it out loud. She signed it again, slower, bigger, so the king could speak it for the hall. And he turned, and he spoke her words into that room in his plain, even voice, and the room learned all at once who they'd been pitying for a decade. This is what he said, what she said. I've told it so many times now it comes out smooth, but the first time I heard it I had to hold the doorframe. She says, the king began, that she is not mute, that she chose silence the winter she came here, when she was 9 years old and had just buried her brother, because she had learned by then what happens to a girl who is alone and useful and easy to ignore. She says a silent girl is overlooked. She says she made herself overlooked on purpose, because being overlooked was the only safe thing she knew how to be. He paused and read her hands again and went on. She says she understood every word any of you ever said in front of her, every cruel one, every kind one. She knew which of you fed her when the goats took the rest of the food, and she knew which of you called her broken behind a hand. She kept all of it. She had nowhere to put it but inside, so she kept it. The hall was so quiet now, I could hear the heather sprig fall out of her hair onto the stone. And she says, the king went on, and here his voice changed, went hard and flat, that she knows exactly what this man is. That she has spent the whole summer watching him decide to claim her because she was silent. Because silence can't testify. Because 2 women lie in the ground behind him, and there was no one left to say their names out loud, and he thought he'd found a third who came pre-silenced, who'd never speak a word against him because the whole valley had already decided she couldn't. I looked at Vaughn. The red had gone out of his face. His men weren't laughing. She says, the king finished, and now he was looking only at Lyra, that her answer is no, that it has always been no, that she only ever needed someone to ask her in a way she could answer. There was a roaring silence, and then the whole thing came apart at once. Vaughn made the mistake of his life. He laughed, a short, ugly, disbelieving laugh, and he said, "This is my king, with respect. You're taking the wild signs of a touched girl and a stranger's clever guesses and building a slander against a loyal lord. There's no proof of a word of it. 2 mates lost to fever and a hard birth, and now I'm a what? A murderer on the say-so of a mute and a hand-waving game." And the king looked at him for a long, long moment. "You keep saying she can't speak," he said. "I'll tell you what I noticed the moment I walked in. Every other soul on that bench was looking at the floor or at their families or at you. Frightened the way prey is frightened, small, hopping not to be seen. She wasn't. She was watching the door and counting your men, and she'd already worked out which of them was slowest and which window was nearest. That's not the fear of a girl who doesn't understand. That's the readiness of someone who has understood everything for a very long time and learned to plan around it." He let that sit. A simple girl doesn't plan her escape from her own claiming before the elders even risen. I've led men in war. I know the difference between someone who's lost and someone who's surrounded. She is the second one. And I will not stand in a hall of mine and watch the second one get handed to a man with 2 graves behind him, because nobody could be troubled to learn her language. Then he turned to the elders, and his voice came down like a gate. "The claim is refused, by her right under the law, witnessed by me, and as for the lord of the eastern ridges and his 2 lost mates, there'll be questions asked now, proper ones, out loud, the kind a Silent Valley should have asked years ago." He looked back at Vaughn, and something in that look made the big man take a step backward. You came here counting on silence. You're going to find this pack's about to get very loud. I won't pretend it all resolved clean and quick, like in the songs. It didn't. The questions about Vaughn took the better part of a year, and old fears die hard, and there were those who grumbled that the king had no business overturning a lord's claim on the strength of hand signs. But once the silence broke, it broke for good. A washerwoman from the eastern ridges who'd held her tongue for years out of fear came forward about the second wife. Then another. It turns out Lyra wasn't the only one who'd learned that being quiet was safer than being heard. She was just the one who finally got asked. Vaughn didn't see another autumn as lord of anything. I'll leave it there. The mountains keep their own accounts. But it's Lyra you want to know about, isn't it? Everyone does. She started speaking. With her voice, I mean her real voice, the one she'd locked away at 9 years old, not all at once. It came back the way feeling comes back into a frozen hand, slow and prickling and painful. The first word I ever heard her say out loud, she said to me, about a week after the gathering, standing in my doorway with a basket of the heather she knew I used for the winter coughs. She held it out and she said, rough and rusty and barely there, for you. 2 words. I sat down on my own step and wept like a fool. And the king. Yes, I know what they say in the songs, and for once the songs aren't far wrong. He didn't claim her. That was the whole point, wasn't it? He, of all people, was never going to do to her the thing he'd just stopped another man from doing. He gave her a place instead. A real one at the hold, learning the keeping of records and the reading of the Rivertown tongues. Because a person who'd taught herself a whole language in secret and used it to survive a decade was not a person you set to minding goats. But he came back, through the years that followed more than a king had any cause to a small mountain pack that held nothing he needed. He'd ride up the valley and he'd find her, and the 2 of them would sit by the river and talk for hours, half out loud and half in the sign speech, switching back and forth, a conversation only the 2 of them could fully follow. I used to watch them from a distance and think, there it is. That's the thing she never had. Someone who can hear her in every language she's got. What grew between them grew slow, and it grew because she chose it, every step, with the full use of a voice nobody could talk over anymore. Which is the only way it could ever have been right, after everything. The man who'd refused to let her be claimed was never going to claim her. He waited until she could ask for him. And one spring, finally, she did. I'm too old to have made that journey down to the hold for the joining, but they tell me that when the elder asked the old question, do you consent, she answered it twice. Once out loud in her own returned voice for the room, and once in the signed speech just for him. I think about that a great deal, now that I'm near the end of my own road. About how many of them sat on that bench over the years, and how many got asked the question in a way they could truly answer, and how few. About all the silence we mistook for simpleness, all the stillness we mistook for not understanding, all the people we decided about instead of asking. She wasn't broken. She was never broken. She was the cleverest soul that valley ever raised, and she taught herself to disappear because disappearing was the only mercy on offer. It took a man who'd learned to count the things others hoped he wouldn't to walk into a loud, drunk, certain room and notice the one person in it who was perfectly, deliberately quiet, and to understand that the quiet wasn't emptiness. It was a held breath, 10 years of it. He just happened to be the first one who ever leaned in close enough to hear it.